Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the special show we've got this evening, 8 p.m. here in the UK, 3 p.m. Eastern Time in the States. And yeah, we've got a really interesting conversation I want to have with you. It's a topic that we've talked about before, and we've had other people on to talk about it, and it's still is one that fascinates me, and I think you'll find what we're going to talk about now really interesting. If I can just tell you that our guest, who I'm going to bring on in a second, he's called Robert K. Tanenbaum, a New York Times best-selling author. I think he's got 29 legal thrillers. Before publishing his first novel, Robert had an accomplished legal career. He served as a bureau chief of the criminal courts, ran the Homicide Bureau in New York City, which I think must have been pretty interesting, and probably also significantly was deputy chief counsel to the Congressional Committee investigations into the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. He's also served 2 years as mayor of Beverly Hills. So he's a very interesting guy. So without further ado, can I welcome into the studio Robert K. Tanenbaum. Hello, Robert.
How are you?
Good. I'm very well, Robert. Good. It's good to see you. Thanks so much for giving us your time. And we're very interested, as I say, in this particular topic. I mean, it's amazing because it happened a long time ago now. 1963 is gone into the past, Robert. But it still fascinates people. There's still an awful lot of interest in this topic. Now, you've got a new book. We just bring up Robert's book, Jet. This is a new book. That Day in Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald did not kill JFK. Well, Robert, do you want to talk us through that? It's a very definitive statement. So tell us about your book. How did you think, how did it come about? And then let's go into the details in the book.
Well, what happened was, as you correctly said, I had worked before going to Washington. Out of law school at Berkeley. I was at college and law school at University of California at Berkeley. I actually went there to play basketball and baseball, when all of a sudden the world came in with respect to the politics that the student body, a good portion of the student body shared, very sophisticated in that regard. They were doing voter registration drives down in the South and other things. And it was a kind of experience where you learn more outside the classroom necessarily than within it. But I also say this, within the classroom, there was no professor in those 7 years I was at Cal that I ever perceived them trying to proselytize in any way to fit the course into their philosophy. It just never happened. And going through what we're seeing now, of course, which is somewhat sickening with respect to the mistake of history these people are making, or maybe they're not, they're just being paid by the Soros crowd in order to create. Yeah. There's a big factor, there's a big part of that. But from my point of view, it was always what are the issues that we're most concerned about, and what was the nature of our government's role, if any? Because what we wound up having really was the government for the last 62 years. A good argument is made, which I will make with you if you wish, that the government knowingly contrived a predetermined conclusion through the pretense of an investigation. And both the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations disregarded very, very powerful evidence, and which they never even took down, which was, broadly the major evidence. A lot of evidence, as you can imagine, comes from the Parkland doctors. These trauma experts got the body right away, and none of those doctors were called to testify because the CIA was operating its own issue, and that is to say that this unelected group of agents in an agency would define what was right and wrong, and then have sanctions for what they believe people were violating, which is the Supreme Court just ruled on this not that long ago, 6-7 months ago, and the case is Raimondo, and they said that what we're saying here, in essence, is that Article 1 is the legislative branch, as you will know, of the Constitution. And it has an oversight role to play with respect to what Article 2 does, which is the executive branch. And how well they play that role is significant because each branch sort of wants to go off on its own. And I'll give you a quick example of that. When President Trump was first elected, he took on, in part, when I say took on, he wanted to straighten out a lot of the issues that had resulted from executive intelligence. Every executive department has its own intelligence. So Central Intelligence, that is the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, is another agency. It's not something super special, although it's developed into that. And there's some interesting history I want to mention to you about that, about the awareness of it and the criticism of it.
Yeah.
The reasons that we're going to chat about here. And so my concern has always been, I guess, Chuck Schumer, unfortunately, the United States Senator, I'll drop my opinions in this way, I'll tell you. Unfortunately, from Brooklyn, where I grew up, the United States Senator had this to say about Trump, trying to pin down the CIA. And he said, I thought Trump was a smart guy, but gee whiz, how smart can you be to take on the executive intelligence agencies? Because you know what? There were 8, 10, whatever the number was, ways to Sunday for them to get back at you. This is a guy of intelligence. This is an oversight person of the United States Senator, of the Senate at the time, who was in the majority, of course, and he's afraid of the CIA.
Yep.
Well, what happened here? The CIA are working for the Article 1 people. They don't have the right, as the Supreme Court rightly noted recently, to say, hey, you know what? These are the new rules, ladies and gentlemen of America. And if you don't follow them, we'll sanction you. Well, guess what? They weren't elected to do any of this. You want to have rules? You want to have sanctions? That's when you get involved with Article 1, the legislative branch. They're elected. And if you don't like what they're doing with these new rules and regulations and legislation, get rid of them. That's what should be going on in our country. And regrettably, it's not. I'll give you an example of some concerns here, and I would like to share with you that it happened with respect to when I first went to Washington, for example. Now, again, I had been in the DA's office in Manhattan, working for legendary DA Frank Hogan, who was the DA. He was in the DA's office from 1935 to 1974. And his predecessor was Tom Dewey, Mr. Republican. Hogan was a lifelong Democrat with liberal conservative and Republican support, always it's a 4-year term, as you know, as being DA in New York City in Manhattan, which is New York County. And that's why when we wrote letters as kids, it would be New York, New York. God knows why we did that. But, we finally took this a college education for some of us like me to figure out New York was New York County, New York City. Okay, but what happened was an interesting thing occurred with President Truman, who has always been a big fan of most liberal Jews who grew up in Brooklyn. And I say liberal, I mean our parents were very different from our generation, my generation. They came in from Europe, as their parents did. They loved America. And it was a wonderful experience to participate in that love. And so what happened was President Truman, actually, when he left office, I think he had a 20% favorability rating. That's how volatile all this is. And Truman wrote a document on December 22nd, 1963. And the note was that he was very concerned that he was very self-critical, that he permitted the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, our main intelligence gathering organization during World War II, that he permitted that organization to morph into, using his words, the CIA. And the reason for it was, as he said, they're making operational issues and policy without authority. This whole issue that we were just chatting about. And he said that it's caused several explosive difficulties with respect to what our government is doing. And then came a very important piece of evidence in the case, which I was fortunate enough to have. And that was a document from John McCone of March 3rd, 1964. And McCone was a very strong Kennedy person. JFK fired Allen Dulles after the Bay of Pigs in 1961.
Yep.
And he was very embarrassed by that because that was supposed to be a very, very well celebrated, thank you very much, recognition from the Cubans when the American forces were coming in, but it didn't work out that way at all. And so he was very, very, very disappointed with the information that he had. Plus, it was Vice President Nixon in 1959 that made the deal on the whole Bay of Pigs thing, because after all, everybody knew that Nixon would be president in 1960 in the election. And beat JFK. So didn't work out that way, fortunately, for many of us in our country. And McCone and other major bureau chiefs in the government wanted to prevent the American public from knowing that Lee Harvey Oswald was a contract employee of the CIA and the FBI. And oh my God, how can that be? And he's someone that immediately J. Edgar Hoover, formerly head of the FBI, within 1 month said it was Oswald. He did it alone. And there were 3 shots fired from the back that hit the president.
Yeah.
And that was what they've stuck with that for 62 years.
They did. Yeah.
It's amazing. It's totally amazing because it's so with respect to the evidence, which I'm going to go over with you, the evidence is so overwhelming. It's not as though I did anything great here. I want to let the audience know that. It's the evidence here that is immutable. And that's the way I tried cases when I was, as you mentioned, when I was in the Homicide Bureau. Ultimately, and for reasons that are in my book, and everything I say about the evidence here is in my book, That Day in Dallas. The shocking realities of it are that the American public, these individuals in Washington, did not believe that the American public could handle, if you will, the truth about Oswald. Now, we know from evidence that Oswald was a contract employee of the CIA going back to 1957. He was stationed at Atsugi Air Force Base in Japan, where he monitored the U-2 flights, those surveillance flights at 30,000 feet. And one of those planes was shot down. And Gary Powers was the pilot of the plane that was shot down. And Ike was president. And he was mortified about this because they lied to him. That is to say, the Nixon forces and the conservative group in the government at that time, the work has shifted over. It's successfully shifted over to become the working man party of America. I never dreamed that would ever happen. But thank God it's happened, and particularly the way it has happened right now. So the people in the government wanted to protect the American people, that Oswald was not some, although you can accept him for being the murderer prior to any major investigation, but please don't let that get involved with the fact that he worked for the CIA. And so they were concerned about hearsay. They were concerned about leaks. And in it, James Rowley, who was in charge of the Secret Service at the time, Rowley wrote a note to McCone asking him for his opinion about his concerns about leaks that could reveal that Oswald, in fact, worked for the government. And in it, in McCone's response to the document, which sometimes I say letter, memo, but it's a document, dated March 3rd, 64. And in it, McCone says that these leaks and Lee Harvey Oswald's training and suspect activity are very concerning. Why? You'll love this. Because the info in any way, if disclosed to the wrong persons, would lead the media to erroneously claim that this agency and perhaps others, this agency being McCone is now head of the CIA. And he said, and perhaps others were directly involved in the Dallas action. That's how they refer to the assassination. And he goes on, it's a 2-page letter, essentially. The first page is a signature page. And then he goes on in paragraph 6 to say the following. I must have read this 10 times when I obtained this document, this piece of evidence. This is, again, the head of the CIA writing this down to the head of the Secret Service. And then he says, well, while the persons involved in the assassination were in the employ of this agency, meaning the CIA, he said, as well as the FBI, it's impossible to maintain full 24-hour surveillance over their activities. Let me repeat that. McCone states that he's concerned that some of the leaks could get into the wrong hands, and in his lingo, that means the news media.
The media, yeah.
This is one thing I believe the news media got right in the last 62 years, was this whole issue of what was going on here with Oswald, particularly. And he was concerned that people would directly be, that people involved in the doubtless action would be outed. And then that's that paragraph 6 on page 2 of the document. He says, while the persons involved in the assassination were in this agency. I mean, can you imagine what this means when you're a kid growing up in America? You're learning that there is a group of people that murdered the president of the United States. It's so shocking, so shocking. And he said they were involved. They were in the employ of this agency as well as the FBI. When you get a document like that as a trial lawyer, and I had tried prosecuting more cases than anyone else, and there's a reason for it, and I urge you to read the book on that point. The only person who prosecuted more cases than I ever was Richard A. Sprague, who was the chief assistant DA in Philadelphia, who called me in October of '76. He was appointed. I never met him. I never spoke to him. And he called me in October of '76, asking me to go to Washington with him on the House Select Committee on Assassinations, of which he was staff director, just appointed, and chief counsel.
Yes.
And we had several talks thereafter about whether I would do this or not. But we reconciled that we would meet with the committee members, because I was very concerned, as he was, that they would politically explode this committee up and implode it with various political views, which would destroy the search for truth. Because we had no brief when we went to Washington. We weren't there saying we're going to find out about Oswald and show the American people the real truth.
Yeah.
That was not our state of mind at all.
Yes.
Our state of mind was whatever the facts are. And we said this to them. Whatever the facts are, and if they are that Oswald did it and it's 3 shots from the back, which when I get to that, you'll understand how absurd all that is.
Yeah.
But the issue was we did not want to politicize this organization, this investigation.
I can understand that. Yeah. Yeah.
And they agreed. It took them 4 months to demonstrate they lied to us. And why? Because I first ran into Richard Schweiker, Senator Richard Schweiker, important person in this whole story. Senator Richard Schweiker was working for the Senator Church Committee on the executive committee responses to the assassinations of Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
And he was head of a subcommittee. And he called me to his office. And I went to his office, and he handed me his notes. And he said, I just want you to know that the CIA was obstructionist, and they will be obstructionist to you, I anticipate. In your investigation, they will try to sidetrack your investigation. And I have to say this with a broken heart, that as a result of my investigation, he said, that is his investigation, he said that the evidence points to the CIA involvement in the assassination of the president. Well, I just finished 10 years in the DA's office in Manhattan, running the Homicide Bureau of the Criminal Courts. And he was a conservative, Richard Schweiker, Senator Schweiker from Pennsylvania, was considered to be a conservative member, a very low-key guy, not looking for a press conference person, just doing his job as a senator. And so it had impact, what he was telling me, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other aspect of all this was on the line to our committee. The other aspect of all this was that the head of our committee was Congressmember Lou Stokes, who was from Cleveland. His brother was Carl Stokes, the first black mayor of Cleveland. But
Mm-hmm.
Lou wasn't a political person to that extent. He became a congressman because his brother wanted to get that federal money.
Yeah.
And they could put in a new federal district there. That's why I mentioned the brother being the mayor of Cleveland. And they did that. But Lou was a problem-solving person. He was a big-time defense attorney. So we made up a perfect group. He was a big-time defense attorney, and I was the prosecutor person.
Yeah.
But we had a very good working relationship, recognizing what our roles were here.
Uh-huh.
We didn't want to outdo the other at all. We were very forthcoming in everything, and everything I say in that book, I told him basically at some point or other. And I went to see Lou at the end of the 3-4 month period of the committee. I mean, we worked. Sprague was a tremendously dedicated person, a brilliant lawyer, and very, 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 very high integrity person who would not politicize anything like this.
Right. Okay.
And so Stokes, I had subpoenas after I briefed him again on all these facts. And I said the subpoenas were that the information was that the CIA had documentation determining whether or not in their own investigation of what happened, particularly its role, the CIA role, they wanted to very much, I wanted very much, I should say, from the committee point of view, I wanted to see the documents they were discussing. In other words, was the assassination a CIA plan or was it a rogue CIA operation?
Uh-huh.
That's where we were. I mean, so that was a long way. And Sprague and I went through every rat hole you can go through in the course of all this stuff. So he told me that the committee would not support what Sprague and I were doing. I said, what do you mean? I told you, and Sprague said, don't hire us because we're not going to get involved in the politics of this. I then said, definitely don't hire me because I will never compromise on search for truth.
Yeah. And
that is to say, in the business that we're in, you can't politicize this investigation. If you do, we're going to leave. It's your investigation. It's not ours. It's not a Tanenbaum investigation. It's not a Sprague investigation. It's a congressional investigation.
Yes.
And select committees, as you know, last for 2 years. Regular standing committees are there in perpetuity, getting every year, and every 2 years they're the funding that you need to continue. And so he said, and I said, Lou, you shouldn't hire me because the Congress can only work best at compromise. You can't have 415 members of the House of Representatives, all of whom are major executives in their alleged minds, and go forward in that regard. Because you'll get nothing done. So they said, no, we trust you and Sprague, and we believe you'll do what you think was the facts. As we said, thank you. Now I come in for the subpoenas, and there was other things involved with respect to working with the committee people. And Lou said, and I said to him, and we're sitting right across from each other as we are here with mechanics, I will say.
Yeah.
He said, Bob, the majority of this committee is not going to support your request for subpoenas. I said, why you hire me and Sprague?
Yeah.
We told you that you politicize this, we're going to leave.
Yeah.
And he said, we never thought you guys would work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and get to the bottom of this bloody mess. We just stared at each other. My jaw was basically down on the ground, I imagine.
Yeah.
And he said, now what do you want to do now? And I looked at him as I'm looking at you, eye to eye. I said, you have my resignation now, effective immediately. I got my materials together, walked out of the room. And as I walked out of the room, I turned and I said, does this also apply to Sprague? And he said, yes, absolutely. I said, good. I'm going to be meeting with Dick very shortly. I'm sure he'll have some important things to say to you.
Right.
And he did. He said he wanted me to set up a meeting that night, which I did.
Yeah.
And there was a confrontation. It was very respectful. It wasn't
Yeah.
anything outlandish and so on. So that was the background of the entire of the investigation, because what the government then did was, and you have to, shake your head at some of the things they did.
Mm.
That is to say, they created false leads, and they alleged that they had science that supported their finding. And that, before I get into what I call the truth at Dealey Plaza,
Yeah. Yeah.
what the government did was, it stuck to their argument that, notwithstanding, and this is very important, the fourth shot at Dealey Plaza was a shot that came from in front of JFK in the limo.
Yes.
It wasn't as though someone stood in front of the limo and took a photograph. The limo had not yet passed the stockade fence, Knoll Hill area. So when the shot came, it came from geographically in front, hit JFK right in the above the right ear, and the temple area above his right ear, and blew out the back of his head. That was the fourth shot.
That was a kill shot.
Let's stop here for one moment, if we may. And that is to say, I've asked the committee members this question with all sincerity. Everyone who has watched the assassination at Zapruder frame 313.
Yep.
No one has to write this down. It's all in the book. At frame 313 of Zapruder, that frame, remember, it was 18.3 frames per second as he was filming it. In that shot, we see the following. We don't have to have anybody interpret it for us. Gosh, we can do this ourselves.
Yeah.
And what it was a blast that came from the Knoll Hill area, the stockade fence, which, if you look at the film, you will see Zapruder right to his right, looking down now at the stockade fence, because it's blast, boom, this fourth shot. And the people on the bridge, Skinny Holland, who was the supervisor, I have wonderful photos of him in the book, and he was the supervisor of at least 6 people on the bridge with him. That's the railroad bridge, looking down at the motorcade as it was coming to them west on Elm Street.
Yes.
And they all turned to their left, those who were on the bridge, to see what the shot. They saw the smoke coming from the high-powered rifle shot. And then they looked at JFK, and then his head snapped back at impact. It snapped back and to the left, and it resided. His head resided on the right shoulder of Mrs. Kennedy. Now, keep in mind, when you analyze this case, and there on the screen is frame 313. I also had frame 312 to show you right before the shot that hit him in the head, blew his head out. But importantly, I've asked everybody who was lying for the government. You saw his head go backwards. Name one case where someone is shot in the back of their head and their head goes backwards.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
It's an insult. It's a total insult to anyone with any sense of anything, not a PhD or any of that high stuff.
Yeah.
Which is wonderful. And it plays out here as well. Because at no time, and there were many important times where the metallurgical PhDs in America got together and they destroyed the credibility of the alleged science that the government was using. Yes. There's a short article, there's a short little piece here. I'd like to give it to you. And it's called Neutron Activation Analysis. Neutron Activation Analysis, also referred to as N as in Nancy, AA.
Yeah.
And in it, neutron activation analysis is what they call the principal testing component for comparative bullet lead analysis. What does that mean? The government argued, because now they've figured out, they've got a problem here with the shot in the back of the head. How does his head go back and all this nonsense? Well, we'll just let it be there. They never addressed it. To this day, they've never addressed that, which rips apart their entire theory.
In the first place, yeah. No.
With neutron activation analysis, they said, we have the science here for all you wise guys who believe, if you don't believe our science, then you believe the earth is flat. They would go around and say exactly that. They would mock the people who were trying to find out the truth. And NAA didn't make it. Why? In the car, the government argued, in the limo, there were 2 large fragments. And they said that came from 1 bullet. So that's 1 missile in the case.
Yeah.
That a fragment could match a fragment. Metallurgical people said that's impossible. These are the PhDs. Nobody bothered to talk to them. They then said that fragments from Connolly's wrist matched Commission Exhibit 399, which we know as the so-called magic bullet, pristine bullet of the magic bullet theory.
Yes.
Keep in mind, there's an exhibit I have in the book, amongst many exhibits. I have like 25 exhibits. They're fabulous. All in the book that lay out exactly what I'm talking here about these exhibits of NAA that the government swore was the truth here. But now the newspapers were picking it up. And they were saying, can this be, after all, that NAA is not real? It's not authentic? Government's running around with it like a shield. Through the streets, if you will.
Yeah.
NAA is our case because the comparative bullet analysis is what I said. Those 2 large fragments meet the fragments. And then the Connolly one is that the some fragments from his wrist were taken, as I said, and those fragments matched the pristine bullet, they said. Well, where do we go from here? Well, I'll tell you where we went from there. We got a hold of information regarding the metallurgical PhDs, outstanding individuals. No one bothered to get a hold of them and get their opinion. After all, you think that would make sense, right? Why do that when you have the government people telling you everything that's going on for 62 years? Absolute lies. And this is probably one of the biggest lies. It turned out that the FBI now is concerned that all of a sudden they're putting into doubt, that is to say, individuals who are dealing with the metallurgical people and asking them about neutron activation analysis, the NAA.
Neutron, yeah.
And that's what the government was saying was the gospel. And the FBI, to its credit at this point, wanted to have 10 experts, 10 metallurgical PhD experts, analyze the evidence. Not so unreasonable. This is what experts of metallurgical business do, the PhDs. And the individual said, okay, we'll do that. And we'll submit the names to you so you could check their background. This isn't a game we're playing here. It's not like pinochle here. We're not trying to out-Trump you. And they got 10 experts because the newspapers now were coming down heavy on this thing about what's going on here. Is this neutron activation analysis, the so-called science, a fake? And the FBI wanted to know with these experts. And the experts all came back and said the same thing. You cannot, this is it, you cannot match a fragment to a fragment, and you cannot match a fragment to a whole bullet.
Gotcha. Yep. Yep.
That's what comparative bullet lead analysis is. And the experts removed any doubt as far as the FBI was concerned. You can't do it. And so they've been relying in court with agents testifying under oath that you can do it, and they have done that.
But you can't.
Where do you exactly? You can't do it according to the experts that the FBI.
Yeah.
So where do you go with that? I'll tell you where you go with that. The government then decided there was one lab that was doing the CBLA, the comparative bullet lead analysis. Again, NAA was deemed to be the principal testing component for the analysis of the component of testing for CBLA, comparative bullet lead analysis. And the government then decided they couldn't continue to have anyone testify that this was legitimate science because the NAA invalidity, as the experts claim, the metallurgical experts claim, that NAA was not reliable and it offended common sense as well, is a fraud.
Yeah.
But it was invalid scientifically. So, what did they do? The government shut down the one lab in the country on September the 1st, 2005. Shut down the lab. And they prohibited, by order, any FBI agent to ever testify to its legitimacy again. That's the great science that was offered to the American public called NAA. The government itself was so embarrassed, including the FBI, about it being invalid because of the PhDs, the metallurgical PhDs, who gave severe critiques of the NAA.
Fragments, yeah.
And so when I say that the government lied, it's not as though this was some opinion formed by one person. This was something the FBI took very seriously.
Yeah.
The only lab in the country was here in America. Shut down the lab, and they said to every FBI agent, you are prohibited from ever discussing this in court again because it's invalid. It's quite an admission coming from that group, but thank God we had that admission because of what was going on with trying to get to the truth of this case.
Yes.
And one of the other issues that occurred, I think it's important to note so that nobody is mistaken about this. Witnesses have a tendency, based upon my experience of having tried, look, you could do the math. I would say I averaged 2 trials a month for 10 years when I was in the Homicide Bureau.
It's a lot of trials, yeah.
That was even the period of time when I became head of the homicide and the criminal courts. Interestingly, the criminal courts at that time had 250 new cases every day. And they range from trespass, spitting on the subway, up through murder.
Yeah. My
job as head of that bureau was to assure that we would get quality dispositions and not plea bargain everything. And the plea bargain should have some connection to what the punishment should be in the case. And that's what I call no lesser plea kinds of cases that you just can't plea bargain away because of the government. Every defendant has the absolute right to plead to the top count of an indictment. But then the government has the right to argue aggravating circumstances on sentencing.
Yeah.
And the defense has the right to minimize that. And that's what goes on in a sentencing situation.
Yeah.
So the snapback of the head opened up a whole Pandora's box, as well as you had NAA is no longer reliable for the government, which they were pouting all the time. Screwing out. And now we had this frame 313 issue.
Yeah.
But here's the other thing that happened. I think it's very important to note this for purposes of how some good people made some mistakes. Not everybody was involved in a conspiracy here. And here's one of the mistakes they made. Within 0.7 of a second after frame 313, go immediately to frame 328. That's Zapruder frame 328. And when I say Zapruder frame for the audience, is the framing of the 18.3 frames per second that his camera offered.
Yeah.
Because it's 0.7 of a second after the fourth shot. And keep in mind, the first shots that the witnesses said existed came in a flurry. And they said there were either 2 or 3 shots.
Yeah.
First flurry. Well, keep in mind that they didn't have the ability to get involved in the science as the way I was able to because of the time that had passed. And that would be the scientific audiovisual acoustics and the immutable evidence. And here's what it resulted in. But keep in mind, the witnesses only believe generally that you're a good witness, a so-called good witness, a valuable witness. If you can say, in a shooting, I saw the defendant with the smoking gun and I can identify him in a lineup thereafter. They think that's the ground rules. And they're wrong. They're wrong in good faith. Most people aren't walking around with notebooks taking notes.
No.
They're
No.
to the President of the United States.
Yeah.
But that's pretty much the mentality you wind up with witnesses. But I always insist on, and that's how we investigated this case, Sprague and I, as if we were investigating a homicide case, which this was. This was a case. That's what it was. And so it turned out that 0.7 of a second after the fourth shot, there was a fifth shot. And the fifth shot came from the rear, from the industrial building areas on Elm meeting Houston Street. Houston was the north-south street. Every time I say Houston in New York, I'm worried I'm going to say Houston. Because there's a Houston Avenue in New York City in Manhattan. But anyway, it's Houston Street. It's the north or south street. And that's where they make the left turn off Houston onto Elm with the motorcade. And it's what we called the fifth shot, which we were able to create as a result of this investigation. Why? Because the fifth shot created fragmentation that could have only occurred from a shot. And here's the fragmentation that we wind up with before anybody realized 0.7 of a second at frame 328. Now we're beyond frame 313. And these are the four things that we saw from fragmentation. The first was the head moved forward, even though he was dead, lying in he was literally bodily depressed, immobile, slumped dead in his wife, JFK's wife's right shoulder as a result of the fourth shot. The fifth shot, and that's why you have to watch the head in this case, not the body. The body's not moving the head is moving the body. So when he gets hit with the fourth shot, it snaps him back. Again, an impossibility if you're shooting only, as the government says, from the back. How does the head go back if you shoot him in the back of the head?
Yeah. It's impossible.
It doesn't happen that way. And we see it. But the fifth shot, his head moves forward because of the force that forced his head to go forward. He was shot in the back of the head at the top of the cowlick on the fifth shot. And the four things that it did was it enlarged the wound of the fourth shot. And you can see that in the 18.3 frames per second. Part of his head drops over above the right ear on his right ear side. It's a flap almost. Second thing, so his head moves forward. It enlarged the wound. And then it did two very important things. It damaged the interior of the windshield to the left of the rear view.
Right. Okay.
Before that, we know with frame 255, for example, that there was no damage to the car, to the limo at frame 255. The damage in the first shots end at somewhere between frames 224 and 230, Zapruder frames. We know that there's no shooting after that, which is very important because when I say I had the ability to have the science in this thing, which the others did not have, 0.7 of a second, the fifth shot, because of this fragmentation, damage to the limo, and Connolly's right wrist is severed. The axial nerve is severed with a fragment. That's the fourth thing that this fragmentation does. No one knew about the fifth shot. And the fragmentation severs the axial nerve and destroys the tendon between his right thumb and index finger. He was holding the white Stetson hat.
Yeah.
Keep that in mind. He was holding it the way I am right here, for example. That you flip it over, it's on his head. Flip it off, it's on. And he dropped it. Throughout all of the shooting, the only time he drops it is at this point when that bullet hit the cowlick off the top of the head and created these four fragmentations. Otherwise, how are these fragmentations occurring but for a fifth shot? So when people said, hey, I was there and I saw Kennedy's head go forward, it's not that they're lying, they're mistaken in good faith. And I always want to deal with these people in good faith, believe me. They're not running around saying all this stuff is, evil and so on. But they made a mistake. The fourth shot, for sure that Kennedy gets his head blown off. Clint Hill was a Secret Service agent, recently just passed away. Hill, when he hit the back of the car, to protect JFK, too late, but he looked down, he said, he wrote a book about this sometime later, and he saw an empty hole in the back of JFK's head. When you get to the witnesses of the Parkland doctors, and these are witnesses that weren't called by the committee investigating this. Here, get this. This is just a quick outline here.
Mm.
The head of the group, the Parkland doctors, was chief of neurosurgery. His name was Kemp Clark. And he observed and gave testimony that he saw the gaping hole in the back of the president's head. I produced 50 witnesses who saw this.
Yeah.
Except for some of the agencies of our government. And Kemp Clark said that he observed this gaping hole in the back of JFK's head. And he said the lower right occipital bone in the back of our head meets the parietal portion of the back of our head. And he saw the cerebellum. That's how serious this wound was to JFK's head after the 4th shot.
Yeah.
Then you have Dr. Robin McClellan. He drafted you've seen this. You've seen the diagram that McClellan has drawn. It's a big opening in the back of the president's head.
Yeah.
That he observed when he was in Parkland Hospital.
Yeah.
Because there's a kicker to all this. And here's the kicker. The government, again, decided to take things into their own hands, which is why, if you could imagine, which is unimaginable to anyone who's presenting evidence about this case, not to put on these witnesses, several more witnesses from Parkland.
Yeah.
And here's what the government said was the reason. Well, we did an autopsy. And in the autopsy, it's much more intense and used for public scrutiny more than trauma room people are.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, that's true. They're looking at organs. When you have an autopsy, you're looking at organs.
Yes.
Every one of my murder cases, I had testimony from Dr. Milton Halpern, who was probably the finest expert in this entire field, and other great ones, other great, highly accomplished doctors testify in all these cases. But the bottom line to all this is, how do you go about trying this case in any way and not putting these doctors on? Because here's the insulting portion again. This is like NAA again. And they said, so what are you talking and making a distinction between those who were at the autopsy? There were 16 witnesses. I believe there were 16 witnesses, 26 witnesses at autopsy. We'll get to that in a second. And why are you doing this? And they said, because you can't rely upon what these doctors in trauma rooms say. I say, explain this to me. Are you saying that the doctors in the trauma room at Parkland were incapable of determining what the shots were that hit JFK? What do you do? I demand it. Tell us, everyone, what you do when you're in trauma room. What do you do? Don't you? I'll make it easier for you when they're funfering around trying to get some nonsensical answer to that. I say, look, isn't it fair to say that the trauma room people, including Dr. Kemp Clark, a neurosurgeon, would look carefully at the entire body? The head was blown out of it. His head was blown out, basically.
Yeah. Based
upon witnesses like Clint Hill, the Secret Service agent, on and on. Bobby Hargis, who was a motorcycle expert, a motorcycle person in the whole parade of individuals. He's on the Jackie Kennedy side on his motorcycle. He gets splattered with blood, brain, bone from the president's head. Drops his motorcycle, runs across the street to the north side of Elm, looking to see who the shooters were. Witnesses said the shooters were right there in that area by the stockade fence. People who were on the grassy area, some had children, and they put the children on the ground and covered their body so that they wouldn't be hit by some gun battle that might be going on. Some of the witnesses actually saw the head blown off, and they said, my God, what else is there to shoot?
Yeah.
So the fifth shot and the corroboration for it is very important because it does satisfy, as far as I'm concerned, a lot of what the witnesses had seen, that they actually picked it up after the fourth shot. So that when they saw the next shot and heard the next shot, which was the fifth shot,
yeah,
they saw president's head go forward. Now, a lot of people say they were lying. I don't buy that. These were good and decent people who were testifying to what they observed. And what they were observing was, in fact, that his head did go forward on the fifth shot. And that's what we were able to determine for history, was that all of these fragmentations that I just mentioned.
Yes.
The fragmentation that severed the wrist, the axial nerve, in Governor Connolly's right hand. He drops that Stetson. He can't hold it. It would be the equivalent of getting shot in the shin bone.
Yeah.
You couldn't stand up again. Couldn't stand up. You'd fall to the ground. Same thing with this, and including severing that tendon on his right hand between the thumb and the right index finger. So that is very important, as well as the damage to the interior of the windshield of the limo that occurred as a result of those fragmentations, those four fragmentations.
Yeah.
So I was very proud of the fact that we were able to deal in a very effective way with what the evidence was, putting together again what happened. Not just say, hey, your head doesn't go back if you're shot in the back of the head. We all know that.
Yeah.
Evidently, not some people in the government that.
Yeah.
And I think that the other thing I think was very important is the people who were involved in trauma did everything they could to save Kennedy's life. They knew where the injury was. You didn't have to have an autopsy in order to determine where the injury was, nor did you need an autopsy to say, hey, we don't trust the trauma people here. My God.
Yeah.
Anything, if I walked in there with a broken arm, they would be able to see my broken arm and try and, deal with that so that I would, again, somehow have use of my arm. Similarly, the same situation exists here. So I think that all that we're talking about here is the following and the timing. I just wanted to mention the timing of all this because the witnesses at the scene said the first flurries were 2 or 3 shots. It turns out that there were 3 shots. But they're pretty close. Remember, they told this to law enforcement within an hour of the assassination. So they said 2 or 3 shots. In fact, there were 5 shots.
Yeah.
And the first flurry had 3 of them.
Yeah.
And of all the seconds that this shooting took is approximately 8.3 seconds at Dealey Plaza.
From start to finish.
8.3 seconds. And when the witnesses said the first shots happened very quickly, 2.6 seconds. Now, they didn't have a stopwatch like I had all this other material to count fragments, to count frames, and so on. But then when JFK is hit, his head snaps back. We know all about that part. And the pause, they said there was a pause after the first flurry. Turns out that pause was 4.8 seconds.
Yeah.
Now, that's what I consider good witnesses. That they're telling exactly as they recall it. And it helps in search for truth. That's what I'm saying. Now, getting back to our government, what did they do? What did they do? They decided that in their ill wisdom, they would try and demonstrate that the forensic medical panel report should reflect really what happened here. It was a throwaway, what I call super paragraph. I think this will shock you. I shouldn't have said that. I don't want to prejudice you as a witness. I'm going to call you as a witness.
Okay.
And that is to say, and everyone should go and read this. It's a matter of public record. At page 37 of the Forensic Medical Panel report of August 1978. Remember, Sprague and I started at the committee on January 1st, 77. And this was this was the end of the second year of the panel, this little throwaway paragraph that I'm just now going to read to you. And it's part of the forensic medical panel report of August 78, because as soon as we left, the first thing that the committee did was hire experts who were CIA agents. What do you need to know here?
It is really, yeah.
And so here's what happened. Forensic medical panel report, October 78. It's near the end of the life of the select committee. 2 years from January 1st, 77. Dick and I leave in basically March of January, February, March, April, in that area. We leave the committee. And I stayed to help in transition for them, which was a total waste of time given the persons they retained. Here's what they did. In this report, which had nothing to do with what I'm about to read to you, the government was intent on still spoiling this case. Here's what they wrote, quote, Parkland doctors must be mistaken about seeing the evulsive head wound because all 26 witnesses, there were 26 witnesses, I said maybe 16, there were 26 witnesses at the Bethesda autopsy. This is what they've written down. These were what the people wrote down after Sprague and I left. Let me repeat this. The Parkland doctors must be mistaken because of the evulsive alleged head wound that was allegedly seen. But all of the 26 witnesses at Bethesda at the autopsy did not see the head injury. Everyone must have been mistaken. Now, here's the kicker to this. If you try the case, remember the first piece of evidence I told you I had here about Dr. The first pin I had about John McCone, head of the CIA?
Yeah.
He said that the CIA people were involved in the assassination, people in his own agency. Get ready for this one. Parkland doctors must have been mistaken regarding the evulsive head wound they allegedly saw because all 26 witnesses at Bethesda during the autopsy did not see any head injury. Now, what I'm about to tell you is you look up, just like you do after the McCone letter, an admission by the head of the agency saying that they were involved.
Yeah.
My agency was involved. The Bethesda witnesses, all of them, not only saw the gaping hole, but they gave testimonials to the committee that they saw the gaping hole. Now, when you get something like that in these two pieces of evidence, you look heavenly, and you say, with a bit of, with a large bit of irony, you look heavenly and you say, "Thank you, God.
Right.
I can handle it now."
Yeah.
As a trial lawyer, that's what your thoughts are when you do all this, because everything you're doing in the case, you're saying, what is exculpatory? What is exculpatory? You must turn that stuff over at the earliest possible convenience. And here you have a situation where it's NAA all over again. They're claiming that the witnesses at the Parkland doctors, they couldn't have been right, because at page 37,
they said
the head of the staff allegedly writes down in black and white that all 26 witnesses didn't see it. How can that be? How do you do that? If a doctor, by the way, I mentioned the broken arm before. If someone walks into a doctor's office holding their arm or their leg that's broken, I've been through all this myself playing ball. I can give testimony to this.
Okay.
And you don't have to, it's my arm, my shoulder, blah, blah, blah. Bango, they're right on you. They're taking care of you. They're removing the pain as best they can, and so on and so on. It's not something that can be made up. Much less, in this case, making up neutron activation analysis as the ultimate test. And then the page 37, that the Bethesda witnesses I never saw the gaping hole.
Apart from the fact
it's so outrageous that
yeah,
you don't even know where to begin or end on that kind of stuff. But I just do want to mention to you that when I want to give proper credit to Bob Groden, Groden, Bob Groden was a consultant to our committee in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And so many people worked so hard. Again, without a brief for what was going to happen prior to the findings. And he was a photographic consultant expert who worked with me on this. And he was baffled because I said to him, how did all these 4 episodes occur? Connolly being struck in the wrist, the limo damaged in the interior to the left of the windshield, the head moving forward on impact when he's already dead. And how in God's name does all that happen without another shot? And that's when we went frame by frame, and we hit at frame 328.
Yeah.
We saw that damage to the interior of the windshield. And that opened up a Pandora's box of important evidence. That's why you just don't quit on this stuff. You just try and do as best you can and use common sense. And listen to what the witnesses are saying. Because as I say to you, all the things they were saying were vital. You don't have to tell me there were really only 3 shots, Mr. Tanenbaum. 2 or 3 was sufficient. And then we had the science to say how many shots were there. So all of that really played an important part. And I was delighted to be a part of dealing with all this. Because I'll tell you something very, very on sort of closing this out a little bit for you. A major problem took place. I think you'll love this. A major problem occurs for our lying government characters. Why they do this? They don't get paid enough to do this. Not that it ever would be, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
On December 1963, a problem bursts forward. The Secret Service and the FBI both found that Connolly and Kennedy were struck by 2 separate bullets, and both were shot within 1.9 seconds of each other. Keep in mind the math here. I hate to use it for you, but that's part of this problem. Big problem.
Yeah.
December 63, Secret Service and FBI found that Connolly and Kennedy were struck by 2 separate bullets, and both were shot within 1.9 seconds of each other. Incredible piece of evidence. Why? For the following. Government always propounded that the murder weapon was the Magnum rifle. And that Oswald's prints were on it, you name it. He's the murder weapon here.
Yes.
Only it can't be. Here's why. In order to do the bolt action, to cock this rifle, being ready to shoot, it takes 2.3 seconds. Kennedy and Connolly were hit within 1.9 seconds.
So it couldn't have been it.
You know what you say to the experts on weapons? See, you're out of the case now. We no longer have a murder weapon that's a rifle. Well, now what happened? No, the CIA wasn't to be outdone here by facts. So they simply said to this young lawyer at the time, Arlen Specter, who I know you know him. You may not think you know, but you know who he is. He became the DA of Philadelphia. And Sprague was his chief assistant. But Sprague did all the trial work, and Sprague was the #1 guy in Pennsylvania on anyone who had a serious case. For good cause. He was that brilliant and he was that seasoned. And as I said, he tried more cases than I did to verdict. I'm talking to verdict here. I'm not talking about the phoniness of, I tried a case. That is, you call the foreman in, the jury sat. Oh, the defendant, Your Honor, my client, the defendant, says the defense attorney, wants to plead guilty now. That's a phony argument to make as a trial.
Yeah.
It's a trial. It starts with jury selection and it ends with summations and verdicts. That's what I'm talking about. That's what Sprague would be talking about. So now we have this interesting phenomenon and a dynamite piece of evidence that I haven't yet told you about the truth. And here's what it is. CIA says to Arlen Specter, now that they know they have the manual bolt action necessary to fire successive shots from the Malico Carcano in 2.3 seconds. You can't make this stuff up. CIA says to Specter, who was a staff lawyer at the time, don't let this deter you. You come up with a one-bullet theory. That's the genesis of the one-bullet theory in March of '64. So what is the one-bullet theory? You'll love this. The witnesses said there were at least 2 shots that struck the president, one in the back of the head on the government presentation.
Yeah.
And because, again, they were trying to sell this thing that Kennedy's head went forward. Yeah. But they never talk about the 4th shot. They never talk about the 4th shot. They talk about the 5th shot. Unwittingly, they do that because they want to demonstrate that his head went forward. And everybody understands that if you shoot somebody in the back of the head, his head is going to go forward. It's not coming back.
Yeah.
And they never were able to confront that issue. So the one-bullet theory is the bullet that struck JFK in the back had a downward track.
Yes.
And that for the audience means, and it was a 5 or 6 inches at autopsy below the neckline. Now there was an opening here in Kennedy's neck. And that track was started at 5 or 6 inches below the neckline. Yeah. Down this area in the back, going downward in JFK's back.
Yes.
So what happened here? Well, what happened was, you take a deep breath on this, please, and make sure you have a little cup of water. They said that the bullet stopped and came up vertically, 11 degrees, and exited his throat and hit Connolly's rib and then fractured his wrist. That's the one-bullet theory.
That's the magic bullet, isn't it? Yeah.
And basically, and I have the exhibits in the book. Please look at it if you haven't already. The bullet that we're talking about here is basically undeformed. It's pristine, but there's some deformity as a result of striking the rib.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But there's enormous deformity in striking Connolly's wrist. And I have a separate exhibit on this to show you the difference. So I'm not saying here there was no deformity on striking the rib. There was a little bit of it.
Yeah.
And you determine the degree of it. I want all the readers to determine the degree of it, especially you. You should definitely see the degree of this exhibit that I have in the book. There were 5 shots that the government took, 2 of which were in cotton balls, and of course there was no deformity. Mm-hmm. The other one hit the wrist, the rib rather, of Connolly, and of course, it came out JFK's throat, if you can believe any of this. Mm-hmm. And how can anybody believe this? And it then fractured the wrist of Connolly, the axial nerve right here. Mm-hmm. So that told us the story about the evidence and the lack thereof and some of the incredible stuff. And now I'll give you something that I treasure as just going through the case to test its authenticity. Oh, very good. You can see in that bullet, there is a little deformity at the tip.
Yep.
If you saw the bullet in my exhibit, you will see major deformity in that bullet after it hit Connolly's wrist. Yep. And because the government then conducted 5 shots, and they did. The 4th shot struck the rib, and the 5th shot struck the wrist. And it's a photograph. I have it for everybody to look at.
Yeah.
Major deformity in the 5th shot that hit the Connolly's wrist. So now I offer you the following, and I love to do this because it's so honest. And that is, I can just hear a judge saying, Mr. Tanenbaum, please don't characterize the evidence. The jury will decide that themselves.
Exactly, yeah.
I apologize. It's called minute metallic fragments. And in the minute metallic fragments, this is a perfect view here in this exhibit that you have on the single bullet theory, and how the bullet had to somehow go up vertically 11 degrees and come out the throat when it was coming.
Yeah.
But here's what I offer to you. It's called minute metallic fragments.
Right.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that, but I see the cat wanted to go out. Okay. And the minute metallic fragments, this is so important. The minute metallic fragments were inside JFK's head. And at the side and ranging in height from the temple area. Now, how should you look at this? Well, I would suggest that there were 3 skull x-rays for you to look at. And they're rectangular at about an inch apart. And it goes right through his back of it from the ear area, his right ear. It goes back and it's this wide in rectangular form. Now, let me give you an example of what I'm trying to prove. If someone came to me now and shot me in the back of the head, 1, my head would go forward, not back. And 2, I would at that point have no metallic fragments, minute metallic fragments in the front of my head. If I was shot in the back of the head, okay? Yeah. And here it is. This is an X-ray superimposed on JFK's head, which is on the screen right now. It's a little bit clearer when you see it, but rather than here. But this is a good shot of it. But what happens is with the metallic fragments is the following. There are 3 skull X-rays that demonstrate what I just was trying to show you.
Yeah.
The metallic fragments start off above the right ear particularly and move forward in the direction of the way the blast hit him. It does another thing that is very important. It's not only direction, but there's a whole gray cloud over the center of this from the impact of the shot. And it tells us very, very, very much, as far as I'm concerned, of the direction and the point of entry. So think about that for a second. If we have external evidence, minute metallic fragments that give us the region of the head that was injured, we know contrary to NAA, neutron activation analysis, that is scientifically invalid and is a fabrication and a sham. The NAA, the neutron activation analysis, but the minute metallic fragments are right on point. They're telling us the direction of the wound, all of which you see in the 3 skull X-rays. You don't need me to tell you this. You see the 3 skull X-rays, and you will see the fragment. Superimposed on JFK's head was this rectangle elongation, I guess is the best way for me to put it.
Yeah.
The rectangular elongation. And it goes from above the right ear across up to the front area of his head. And again, the way to think about this is if I was shot in the back of the head, I would have no minute metallic fragments in the back of my head.
No, I understand that. Yeah.
And just you look at the 3 skull X-rays, you'll see the direction and the point of entry, which is a nice piece of evidence to have in the case that helps explain so much of what we're talking about. Yeah. Now, you have some wonderful exhibits that you've been showing here, which I really want the public to see. And they're approximately in the 20s. On one thing that the government did was so mind-blowing to me. They decided to answer the critiques of the head moving backwards, sideways, forwards, and so on, by gelatinizing 10 skulls so that they would look like and be replicas of a human skull. The government, in other words, got a hold of the material and replicated the skulls. And then they put the rifle at the height of the depository window, the so-called sniper's nest, at that distance and height, and they fired the rifle into the head 10 times, 10 skulls. I'm going to make you an expert right now. The shots came from the back. Which way did the heads move? Did all the skeletons move? These were shots that hit the skeletons, the gelatinized skeletons in the back of the head. Which direction did the heads move, the skulls move?
Forward.
You get an A+ for that answer.
Thanks so much. Yeah, obviously, yeah, yeah.
That's exactly what happened. So,
So, so like
go ahead.
it seems, Robert, like, we're coming to the end of our time shortly, so we're going to have to wrap up shortly. But I mean, you've given an incredibly forensic, if I may say, analysis of what actually happened versus what we were told happened. But so I mean, but the punchline on this is that then are you saying it wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald who fired any of the shots, or were there other shooters? What are you saying?
I have avoided giving my opinion about any of this because it's all scientific stuff, as I've explained it to you.
Yeah.
I've reduced this because we had the opportunity to do this. This just wasn't taking witnesses at 2 or 3 shots in the first flurry, and then there was a pause of 4.8 seconds, and so on.
Yeah.
My opinion, which I'm loath to give, and there's just is that the whole story here is an example of government manipulation.
Yeah.
In its worst character, because we have the minute metallic fragments, we have evidence that is very, very solid about what happened. And
it doesn't
why in God's name? I'll give you a quick example here. I have in my list. Mr. Holland is looking down at as I mentioned, he's looking down at the direction of the limo. Mm-hmm. And again, the shots were fired in front of the limo, but not standing in front of the limo.
Yep, get
but
that.
An angle in front and hit him right in the head here. Mm-hmm. And then you had Emmett Hudson, who was in charge of the maintaining the area, and Bill and Gail Newman. They claim they were in the line of fire. These are just some of the witnesses in the line of fire from the stockade, stockade fence area. Lee Bowers was in the tower off up there in the top of that exhibit. You see it when you look. He's there, and he saw he saw the shot. He heard the shot, and then saw the smoke from the rifle, the high-powered rifle. You have the officer Joe Marshall Smith, who went to the stockade fence because people were self-identifying. People were there saying, "There's someone in back of that fence." And when he gets there, he takes out his service revolver. He goes to the depository. He takes out his service revolver and says, "Stop." And this person then says, "Oh, I'm with the Secret Service." All Secret Service at Dealey Plaza were in the parade. They were in work. They weren't wandering around. That was one of the shooters in all probability, who he ran into, Joe Marshall Smith. And then you had Associated Press photographer James Alkins. Alkins, I think, is a great witness. Why? Because he was about to take his camera and film the fourth shot, but he misses it. And then he next sees JFK in the position he was in after he was shot in the head on the fourth shot. He becomes a dynamite witness. He's the only one. Up till then, JFK is braced because he got hit in the back, but he's sitting straight up. And then he gets hit in the head and snaps back into the left.
Yeah.
And then you have Charles Brehm. This is an interesting one. Charles Brehm, Brehm, he had a 5-year-old son with him. They were on the grassy area. Yeah. And they saw the limo turn onto Elm Street and proceed west. But in front of him, shots were fired. And the bullets didn't pass him, obviously, because it happened in front of him.
Yeah.
And then another shot. And then there was another shot he heard that when the limo passed him, and that blew out the head of the president. That was the fourth shot. He doesn't counting him and all, that they would have pad. And then Hawkins says that the president was no longer sitting upright. When I looked up after my camera didn't get that shot in, but it gets in frame 255. It gets in a lot of important stuff where there's no activity, so that we know when the shots were fired, what was hit, and so on. You put it all together. as I try to do for you.
Yeah.
And Brem then has a shot whistled past him, which he claims was the third shot. So he's like a great government witness here, you see, because he says there were 3 shots.
Yes.
All coming from the back. Yeah. But here's what he saw. Brem saw, let me put it this way. He saw 2 shots fired, one in front of him, one in back of him. The one in back, which he claims is the second shot, was really the 4th shot. That blew his head off. He says it. That shot blew his head off.
So it was the 4th one. Yeah.
Yeah. And Brem then said, when there was another shot, the 3rd shot whistled past him. Now, why did I include him in all this? Because Brem had a 5-year-old son. Brem was at Pointe du Hoc. He was there at Normandy. And he was in battle in Omaha Beach.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where Pointe du Hoc was, the Nazis had these high-powered rifles shooting at the Americans coming off that landing craft.
Yes.
So they never would make it in there. So you got to get on your hands and knees and shed some tears for the families who went through all this and their sons never came home again.
Yeah.
And, say what they want about our government. I say that I don't care who we are. The kids still remain the same way. They still have that sense of right and loyalty. I believe that.
Yeah.
But what happened was, Brem realized, he said, why would there be this last shot that whistled past me? He was in battle for 2 weeks at Pointe du Hoc. That's what they call that high point at Normandy. Yeah. And he got wounded. And he then covered his son, worrying that there would be a shootout. Because what was the reason for that 3rd shot? The 2nd shot, according to him, blew up Kennedy's head.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
So then, why do anything about it? And there's a speech that President Reagan gave. I think it was the finest words Reagan ever delivered. I have it in the book. I urge you to take a good look at it. It's a couple of paragraphs about these boys who fought a war, who conquered a continent, who provided our freedom. These boys, these men, these heroes, these warriors.
Yeah.
Take a good look at that and say to me, I'll go around with you and give out that speech to every kid in every school in this country. Yeah. You want to know who we are? That's the best definition of who we are. So, and then of course Bobby Hargis and the ability to have the acoustics, the science, the visual aids, and the audio. So that pretty much wraps up what I have to say about all this. I hope I haven't taken too much of your time, but
no, it's been incredibly, I think you've given me the most forensic analysis of what actually happened, explaining it, Robert, that I've ever heard. So, it was a shocking moment in history, the assassination of an American president and 3-letter agency involvement. Actually, one of the things I kind of feel that we may have been due a repeat of that last summer on July 13th, when President Trump was campaigning, and he almost was assassinated in front of the world in a kind of similar way. I mean, there, but for the grace of God. So it is scary to think that the United States, which a lot of us look to, Robert, I'm a big fan of the United States, but these agencies, the way they operate, some of the nefarious characters within them is very, very, very disturbing. But all I would say is, I think you've given us an excellent summary. And can I just bring up on the screen? Look, everybody, please. This is Robert's book, The Day in Dallas. Harvey Oswald did not kill JFK. All the details, all the exhibits, everything's in the book. So please go and check out the book. It probably will give you the best insight into the events of that day in Dallas, which are historic. Robert, can I thank you so much for your time. Thank you for giving me, I do appreciate it. It's been lovely to meet you. And I hope you've enjoyed it from your side as much as we've enjoyed it from our side.
Not only do I enjoy it, but I thank you. Because through meetings like this that I feel that we could get to the truth, which is so critical here, as you said. So I thank you very much for giving me the chance to answer your questions and dig into some of the materials.
I appreciate that. Listen, Robert, thank you so much. And everybody, thanks for listening tonight or watching or wherever you are. We're on YouTube, we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, X, we're everywhere. So wherever you're watching, I hope you've enjoyed this wonderful conversation with Robert. And I will be back again tomorrow night, same time with a different guest. But from Robert and myself for tonight, it's good night.